You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and since Thanksgiving is coming up in a few days, I thought this is the perfect time to look at one of the largest and most highly visible public art exhibitions in the world. Although it's rarely thought of that way. I'm talking about the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Millions of people watch for the spectacle, and here I want to talk about the engineering, the sculpture, and the history behind these floating marionettes. Now, to understand the parade, let's start by looking at the man who kind of started the modern balloon parade, Anthony Frederick Sarg. He was born in Guatemala in 1880 to a German diplomatic family, and Sarg moved to London and eventually New York City, establishing himself as an illustrator and master puppeteer. He was known for his marionette theater, but his relationship with Macy's began in the early 1920s when he was hired to design the store's mechanical Christmas window displays. When the store's employees, many of whom were first-generation European immigrants, suggested a parade to celebrate their new American heritage using the festival traditions of Europe, Macy's turned to Sarg to serve as the artistic director for the event, originally titled the Macy's Christmas Parade. The inaugural parade occurred in 1924. It was a street pageant that stretched 6 miles, featuring floats pulled by horses, employees in costumes, and even live animals borrowed from the Central Park Zoo, including elephants, camels, and tigers. As you can imagine, Sarg found the live animals to be a logistical hazard. They were frightening to children and difficult to manage on the streets. He wanted a sculptural solution that could be seen by vast crowds, but remained safe and controllable. Drawing on his background in puppetry, he designed animals made of rubberized silk that could be inflated and manipulated from below. While Tony Sarg is a legendary figure in the artistic history of the parade, it's always been a group effort. The artists behind the parade are a collective known as the Macy's Parade Studio. In 1968, the design operations moved from New York City to a former Tootsie Roll factory in Hoboken, and later a custom facility in New Jersey. This studio operates year-round with a team of full-time painters, carpenters, engineers, and sculptors. They're responsible for everything from the maintenance of existing assets to the fabrication of new balloons. And they do all this using a combination of traditional old world modeling techniques and modern 3D computer-aided design. Now, here are 5 quick things to know about the history and artistry of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Number 1, the balloons were originally designed as upside-down marionettes. When Tony Sarg decided to replace the live zoo animals in 1927, he applied the physics of puppetry to a new medium. The traditional marionette is controlled from above by strings that fight gravity to pull the puppet up. Sarg realized that if he filled a bladder with a gas lighter than air, the puppet would naturally rise and the strings or tethers would be used to pull it down. This required a total inversion of the puppetry mechanics. The handlers on the street, originally comprised of Macy's employees, acted as the crossbar of the marionette controller. By coordinating their movements and tightening or loosening lines, they could make the giant balloons nod, wave, or turn their heads. This technique is still used today. The balloons are filled with helium for lift, and the nuanced movements come from the specific manipulation of the tether lines by the handling teams under the direction of the pilot. And number 2, for a brief period, the balloons were released into the sky at the end of the parade. From 1928 to 1932, Macy's had a dramatic finale where the balloons were intentionally released into the air at the conclusion of the route. The balloons were equipped with safety valves that would slowly leak helium, allowing them to float for days before landing. Macy's would offer a $50 reward to anyone who found a deflated balloon and returned it to the store. This practice was discontinued due to safety concerns regarding the aviation and just general public welfare. In 1932, a pilot attempted to capture a floating balloon in the air and nearly crashed when the balloon wrapped around the plane's wing, sending it into a tailspin. And that's not the only danger. Balloons would often land in places like the East River or even on top of high-tension wires, and people would take dangerous risks to retrieve that $50 bounty. Number 3. The Parade Studio uses hybrid terms for some hybrid artistic creations, talking about Falloons and Balloonicles. As the parade evolved, the distinction between a rigid float and an inflatable balloon began to blur, leading the people in the Parade Studio to coin some new terms. A falloon, a float and balloon, is a rolling float that features a cold air inflatable element attached to the chassis. These elements are filled with air rather than helium and don't detach from the float base. A balloonicle, a balloon with a vehicle, is a self-powered balloon. These are typically smaller than the giant character balloons and are driven by a pilot sitting inside the structure. The balloonicle is filled with cold air and mounted on a skid steer or similar utility vehicle, allowing it to move independently down the street without a tow vehicle. The creation of these hybrid artworks requires collaboration between automotive engineers and soft sculpture artists to account for all the visual and practical concerns, like making sure the fabric doesn't snag on the mechanical wheels during operation. Number 4. To transport the balloons from New Jersey to Manhattan, they have to fit in a box no larger than 12.5 feet tall by 8 feet wide. In the parade, we see massive inflated characters, sometimes 50 feet tall and 60 feet wide, but every asset of the parade has to be collapsible. The balloons and floats are constructed at the Parade Studio in New Jersey, but they have to travel through the Lincoln Tunnel to reach the starting line in Manhattan. This logistical bottleneck dictates the engineering of every piece in the show. Floats are built in telescopic sections with folding elements that can collapse down to the tunnel height of 12.5 feet. The balloons are deflated and tightly rolled into storage bins. Once they arrive at the staging area near the American Museum of Natural History the night before Thanksgiving, the inflation process begins. It takes specialized teams hours to inflate the balloons in sections using nets and sandbags to keep them grounded until the parade the next morning. And finally, number 5, the Blue Sky Gallery elevated the parade, turning it into a moving exhibition of high art. In 2005, the parade organizers launched an initiative called the Blue Sky Gallery to combine some fine art with the commercial spectacle. While the parade is largely dominated by pop culture figures like Snoopy and SpongeBob, the Blue Sky Gallery commissions world-renowned contemporary artists to design balloons, treating the sky as a literal gallery space. The series has featured works by major fine artists, including Jeff Koons, Takashi Murakami, Yayoi Kusama, and KAWS. And if you want to learn more about any of them, check the links in the show notes because I have made episodes on all 4 of those artists. And these balloons are often extremely complex. For example, Jeff Koons' rabbit balloon had to mimic the reflective stainless steel surface of his original sculpture, but only using flexible, non-reflective polyurethane. But this initiative has shown that the parade is not just about marketing. It's a fun and exciting exhibition of large-scale kinetic sculptures. Now, after a short break, I want to talk a little bit about the balloon that started it all. Welcome back. Today, we're talking about the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and specifically, I want to look at the Felix the Cat balloon from 1927. Now, this balloon seems kind of rough by today's standards, but this specific work represents the transition from carnival float to aerial sculpture. It was designed by Tony Sarg himself and manufactured by the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio. Felix was a proof of concept that really changed the parade forever. The sculpture was modeled after the silent film cartoon character created by Pat Sullivan and Otto Mesmer. In 1927, pop culture merchandising was really in its infancy. Felix was one of the first characters to have mass appeal sufficient to anchor a parade. Sarg's design was constructed from rubberized silk, a material chosen for its ability to retain the gas while remaining lightweight. Modern balloons are compartmentalized, so they have multiple chambers that will maintain the shape even if a tear occurs and one part sort of deflates. Early balloons like Felix, though, were often a single chamber and had very few internal baffles. Visually, that original Felix balloon was far from the polished, rounded balloons we see today. It was kind of lumpy and irregular in its shape. Photographs from the era showed that it was kind of distorted in the torso, it had long, spindly limbs, and they kind of just dangled beneath the body. But this Felix balloon really laid the groundwork to help them figure out the internal anatomy for all the future balloons. Creating Felix wasn't just about the look. It was an engineering challenge as much as an artistic one. They had to think about the center of gravity as well as the center of lift. To make the character look like it was standing upright while floating, the attachment points for the tether lines had to be calculated very precisely. If the nose is too heavy, the character lies face down. If the feet are too light, it floats horizontally. Sarg and the Goodyear engineers had to invent a rigging system that allowed Felix to maintain his composure. And just an interesting story to end this discussion of the Felix balloon. A later version of the Felix balloon came to a rough sort of fate. During that release era I mentioned earlier in the episode, a helium-filled Felix was released into the sky. It drifted for some time before it got tangled on high-tension wires in New Jersey and caught fire. The rubberized silk was highly flammable, and the destruction of that balloon contributed to the end of that practice of releasing them at the end of the parade. Still, despite the rough appearance and subsequent setbacks, the Felix the Cat balloons will forever hold a special place in history as the prototype that established a parade route as an exhibition space for modern American art.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.